Hey everybody. I hope that initial video that spelled out the guidelines, expectations, and requirements for paper one was helpful when it came to shedding some light on what is expected of you, or at the very least, it helped to ease your mind. There was something that I mentioned in that video, something involving the way that I might approach writing this paper if it was me having to write it, how I might go about structuring my analysis. I said that if this was me writing the paper, I might use that 5 paragraph approach to building my analysis. Okay, so if you think back to high school English, you've got that 5 paragraph approach to writing. You got your introduction, you got your conclusion, and then you got your 3 bodied paragraphs. So what I would do if I were you is I would choose pieces of evidence, 3 examples, hopefully examples that you can draw from the jungle. I'll give you one here in just a few minutes, but things that kind of shed light on this whole idea of equality or inequality in the late 19th century Gilded Age America. So what we're going to be doing here with this video segment is going through a piece of evidence from Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and then kind of linking that to some of the themes, issues, and concepts that we've been talking about thus far in the class in History 1302. So what you need to do, if you haven't done so already, is one, if you've got a paper copy of The Jungle like I do right here, go ahead and grab it. And I'd like you to open up to chapter 11. I'll get a little bit more specific in terms of the page number here in a second, but chapter 11 is where I'm going to start. Now, if you didn't buy a paper book, don't worry about that. Just go into Canvas and then click on the Modules button, scroll down to Online Text, and download yourself a copy of The Jungle. You can put me on pause if you need to, but scroll down. Once you've got it up and running, scroll down to chapter 11. In particular, in the online version of Sinclair, go to the bottom left of page 125. That's going to be several paragraphs deep into chapter 11, bottom left corner of 125. Now, if you're using a book and yours happens to look like mine, that would be page 104. Page 104, same chapter, chapter 11. And if you're using a book that does not look like mine and is not the online, it is a paragraph that starts out, "It was in one of these melees," okay? Again, paper copy of the book, that's 104. If it's the one in Canvas, that's 125. Either way you want to spin it, it's a paragraph that starts out, "It was in one of these melees." What I'm going to do is go through the example, and then we're going to connect it to some of the themes, issues, and concepts that we've talked about in this class so far. So let me set the stage for you, okay, because this should sound relatively familiar. If you are regular in lecture, you've heard me talk about some of these industrial accidents, and you've heard me lecture about how throughout the late 19th century, employers really were not responsible for their employees at the point of production, meaning that workplaces could be utterly disastrous when it came to dangerous working conditions. And if you got hurt on the job, it was basically on you. There really wasn't any recourse for the worker. It was a very different world than one that you and I would recognize here in the 21st century. And the courts more or less backed the companies, backed the employers, primarily because one of the things that they argued was that simply by accepting the job and going into work on a day-by-day basis, you were basically acknowledging that there was a risk at work here. And assuming that risk, if you got hurt, it was kind of on you. So as you're about to find out, there's very little recourse that someone like our friend Jurgis Rudkis would have as far as making him whole if he's ever in one of these accidents. So the situation is this. He's doing his thing as a gut shoveler on the shop floor, and a steer breaks loose. It's on the killing floor. A steer breaks loose, and if you read Sinclair, this seems to happen fairly regularly. It's not like it just happens once in a while. So the steers got loose, and it's every man for himself. Everybody's running in every different direction. It's mass chaos, and sort of that's the setting. That's the backdrop that I wanted to kind of bring you up to speed on before we launched into the example. Now let's talk about the example. Okay, so here we go. It's that paragraph that starts out. It was in one of these melees. It was in one of these melees that Jurgis fell into his trap. That is the very word to describe it. It was so cruel and so utterly not to be foreseen. At first, he had hardly noticed it. It was such a slight accident. Simply that in leaping out of the way, he turned his ankle. There was a twinge of pain, but Jurgis was used to pain, and it did not coddle himself. When it came to the walk home, however, he realized that it was hurting him a great deal, and in the morning his ankle was swollen nearly double its size, and he could not get his foot into his shoe. Still, even then, he did nothing more than swear a little and wrapped his foot in old rags and hobbled out to take the car. It chanced to be a rush day at Anderson's, and all the long morning he limped about with his aching foot. By noontime, the pain was so great that it made him faint, and after a couple hours in the afternoon, he was fairly beaten and had to tell the boss. They sent for the company doctor, and he examined the foot and told Jurgis to go home to bed, adding that had he properly laid himself up for months by this folly, the injury was not one that Anderson and Company, the employer, could be held responsible for, and so that was all there was to it, so far as the doctor was concerned. Let's talk about, first things first, let's talk about what this is going to lead to. What this is going to lead to is Jurgis being fired. If you read on, read through chapter 11, chapter 12, into chapter 13, you're going to find out that the company doesn't really save his job for him. If anything, the company kicks him to the curb. You're only as good as your last day of work, and if you can't stand up for more than 5 minutes before, as you saw with him, you'll literally pass out from the pain, then what good are you to the company? So they fire him, and by firing him, it's going to throw him and his family not only into unemployment, but into poverty. This poverty is very systemic, and it's very much connected to political equality. So let's talk a little bit about some connections here. You want a connection between, unemployment, poverty, and inequality. Look no further than the American Yop and Henry George's Progress in Poverty. If you read that piece, you're going to hear Henry George, who was a social critic at the time, and he penned a best-selling book in the 1870s entitled Progress in Poverty. And in it, he describes this massive economic growth, this unprecedented rocket-like takeoff in the American economy. But he also notes that growing up right alongside this prosperity is grinding and unimaginable poverty. And it's really, at least with this particular example, we can see that an injury that was no fault of Jurgis. If anything, this is the fault of the company for not having things in a safe, decent environment. But in any case, he can't really do anything about it. They let him go, and when they let him go, his family is hurting right now. And so you can see that there's a connection between the example that we just used and the American Yop. And that's one way that you might be able to bring this into the conversation in your paper. If you wanted to make one of those three-bodied paragraphs about hazardous working conditions, things at work that lead to accidents, which leads to unemployment, which leads to poverty, that would be one way that you could connect an example from Upton Sinclair to what we've been talking about, Henry George, and kind of use it as evidence. But let's say that you don't want to use Henry George. Okay, let's talk a little bit about working conditions that we've discussed in the class so far. For quiz 2, I ask you to read not only Andrew Carnegie's The Gospel of Wealth. He's sort of lecturing other rich people like him what they ought to be doing with their money, not spending it on fancy parties or big, luscious, luxurious mansions or things like that. They ought to be investing it in the community as far as he's concerned. But I ask you in that quiz, do you think that Carnegie is essentially walking the walk, right? He talks a good game, but is he backing it up with anything? And to kind of answer that question, I ask you to read On Child Labor, right, which describes the conditions of a coal mine that was similar to the coal mines that Andrew Carnegie owned and operated to fuel Carnegie Steel throughout the late 19th century. What are the conditions that those workers are working in, right? Furthermore, how old are some of those workers? Some of them are literally boys. They're younger, some of them much younger than the age of 18 years of age. And so, in any case, on-child labor is yet another good connector between the example that I just used from the jungle and something that we've talked about a little bit more broadly in the class. So let's discuss one more connector when it comes to this example of the steer getting loose, Jurgis turning his ankle, and leading to poverty. Lecture 2, and keep in mind, my lectures are more than fair game when it comes to things that you can use as evidence in your paper to demonstrate whether or not you think that there's true equality, true freedom throughout the late 19th century. But Lecture 2, Lecture 3, and even Lecture 4 has some good information as far as the role that industrialization played, the role of the nature of industrial work, and how that oftentimes did lead to these accidents, which are very similar to the one that we described. But there is a point in Lecture 2 where I'm describing the New South, okay? The idea that we're going to make the South, after the Civil War, the idea that we're going to make the South look a lot more like the North, and that the South is going to be a land of cities and a land of factories, and we're going to tame the natural resources and put them to use in the industrialized economy. And I told you that that really didn't happen, not to the extent that a lot of people thought that it was going to, but it did have two exceptions. And one of those exceptions was the textile industry, okay? The idea that we were going to not only grow the cotton in the rural South, but that cotton would no longer be sent hundreds of miles away to places like New England. There were new factories that were built in South Carolina, in Georgia, in North Carolina, and the cotton would be sent to these industrial centers, brand new industrial centers with state-of-the-art industrial equipment that made the production of textile way, way, way more efficient than it would be in a place like Lowell, Massachusetts. But we also talked about the nature of those jobs. We talked about how breathing in this dusty air from the lint, from the textile, led to a condition known as brown lung. It was pretty similar to black lung that was suffered by coal miners, but breathing in that hazardous dust all the time was literally hazardous to your health. So there's another connector if you want to connect it in that way. Again, Lecture 2, it's entitled The American Response to Industrial Capitalism. And it also talks a little bit about the use of child labor there as well. I told you that children were used to work in these mill centers primarily because they had small hands and they could reach into parts of the machine, and if the machine was stuck, for example, they could unstuck it and pull whatever was obstructing the gears out. The only problem is when you're talking about a 10-year-old, that 10-year-old might not have the mental capacity to yank that hand out very, very quickly. And long and short is it could crush the hand, it could sever the hand. And so this industrial accident was hardly relegated to industries like the meatpacking industry. I would go so far as to say that it was basically the norm throughout the late 19th century. So here's the takeaways. What I want you to understand here is that it was literally dangerous to work in these factories, as we've seen in at least 3 different examples here alone right now in this video. It was literally hazardous to your health. What's being done about it? Well, the answer is not very much, for not only the reasons that I pointed out, but also other reasons that were political in nature. And it kind of begs the question, might you pull in the concept, the idea of what role, if any at all, what role is government playing? And if it's not playing a role at all, if it's not working to make for a safe and decent working environment, why is that? That might actually be a good idea for another paragraph when it comes to, answering the central question. It's certainly going to be a topic for another one of these video installments, but for the time being, I'm hopeful that this helped everybody. I'm hopeful that you now have a little bit better understanding of what I'm looking for you, what I'm looking for you to get out of the reading of the jungle, and how your reading of the jungle might relate to, might connect to the themes, issues, and concepts that we're talking about in class. So we're going to move on to talk about the area that people like Jurgis Rudkis, working Americans, live. And of course, I'm talking about these urban centers like Chicago. So that'll be something to look forward to in the next video that's coming up in this series.